The small town of Havenbrook, known for its peaceful streets and close-knit community, was rocked by a gruesome crime scene earlier one morning. Detective Jack Cole stood in the dim light of dawn, the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers casting long shadows on the ground. His partner, Detective Sarah Bennett, crouched beside the victim's body, her face a mask of concentration as she examined the scene. Blood splattered the walls of the modest suburban home, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of violence. "This one's different," Jack muttered, his voice low and gravelly. He rubbed the stubble on his chin as he surveyed the room. The victim, a middle-aged man, lay lifeless on the floor, his face twisted in terror. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, and yet the scene reeked of something personal, something deliberate. Sarah glanced up at Jack, noting the intensity in his eyes. "Different how?" she asked. Though she had a suspicion, Jack had a way of picking up on things others didn't, a gut instinct that had solved more cases than she could count. Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he knelt beside the body, his fingers tracing the outline of a peculiar symbol carved into the man's chest. It was crude, hastily done, but unmistakable. A symbol Jack hadn't seen in years. 15 years, Jack finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen this before." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean, where?" Jack stood up abruptly, his face pale. "A case from 15 years ago. Same symbol, same method, same everything." He looked at Sarah, his eyes haunted by old memories. "We never caught this guy. It was my first big case." The weight of his words hung in the air, thick with unspoken tension. Before Sarah could press him further, their radios crackled to life. "Dispatch to Detective Cole and Bennett. We have another 1054. Address is 233 Elm Street. Same circumstances." Jack's heart skipped a beat as he exchanged a glance with Sarah. Without a word, they rushed out of the house, the engine of their unmarked cars roaring to life. As they sped down the empty streets of Havenbrook, Jack's mind raced. His past was catching up with him, and he could feel it in his bones. His case was far from over. The address led them to another quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The scene was eerily familiar to the one they had just left, a small, nondescript house with its windows dark and its front door ajar. Jack and Sarah exchanged a grim look as they approached the entrance, their breath visible in the cool morning air. Inside, the smell of blood was overwhelming. The victim, a woman in her early 40s, was sprawled on the living room floor, the same symbol carved into her chest. Jack's jaw clenched as he took in the scene. Everything was identical. The precision of the cut, the lack of any sign of struggle, and the calm, almost ritualistic placement of the body. Sarah moved to examine the surroundings, but Jack remained rooted to the spot, his eyes fixated on the symbol. The memories from 15 years ago came flooding back, images of another small town, another string of murders, and the faces of families left shattered by the violence. He had been young then, eager to prove himself, but the case had slipped through his fingers, the killer vanishing without a trace. It had haunted him ever since. "This can't be a coincidence," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "What are the odds of the same killer resurfacing after all this time?" Jack shook his head, a storm of emotions brewing inside him. "It's not a coincidence. He's doing this on purpose. He's sending a message." Sarah looked at him sharply. "To who? Us?" "To me," Jack said, his voice cold. "He knows I'm here, and I'm still chasing him. He's picking up right where he left off." Sarah studied Jack's face, noting the tension in his jaw, the dark shadows under his eyes. There was something about this case that was deeper than just professional duty. Jack was taking this personally, more than she had ever seen before. She had always known there was a darkness in Jack, something he kept buried beneath his calm exterior, but now it was surfacing, and it worried her. As they left the crime scene, Jack's mind raced with possibilities. He knew he had to dig into the past, revisit the old files, and find the connection he had missed all those years ago. But as they drove back to the station, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just the murders. The killer had returned for a reason, and Jack was determined to find out what it was, even if it meant confronting the demons he had tried so hard to bury. Back at the station, Jack and Sarah pored over the old case files, spreading them across the table in the dimly lit conference room. The details were chillingly familiar. 4 murders, each victim with the same symbol carved into their chest, each killing methodical, and precise. The killer had vanished without a trace, leaving no fingerprints, no DNA, no evidence that could be used to track him down. Jack sifted through the photographs, his mind working overtime to piece together the puzzle. The murders back then had seemed random, but now with the new killings, a pattern was emerging. The victims from the past and present shared no obvious connections, but there was something about the symbol that nagged at Jack, something he couldn't quite place. "What's on your mind?" Sarah asked, noticing the furrow in his brow. "The symbol," Jack muttered, tracing it with his finger. "It's not just a random mark. It's part of something bigger." Sarah leaned in, scrutinizing the symbol. "You think it's some kind of cult?" "Maybe," Jack replied. "Or maybe it's something personal to the killer. Something that means something to him." As they continued their investigation, Jack's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He was on edge, driven by the intensity that bordered an obsession. Sarah watched him with growing concern, sensing that he was unraveling. She tried to get him to talk, to open up about what was really driving him, but Jack deflected her questions, burying himself deeper into the case. After days of relentless detective work, they finally caught a break. A fingerprint, faint but traceable, was found on the shard of glass at the latest crime scene. It led them to a man named Richard Hale, a drifter with a long criminal record, but no ties to Havenbrook. When they pulled up his file, Jack's blood ran cold. Richard Hale was a name that had come up in the original investigation, a suspect who had slipped through their fingers years ago. "This is it," Jack said, his voice hard. "This is the guy." Sarah looked at him, worry etched on her face. "Jack, you need to slow down. We can't rush this." Jack was already moving, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He knew this was the break they needed, the chance to finally put an end to the nightmare that had haunted him for so long. But as they prepared to confront Richard Hale, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Jack was being driven by something more than just justice, something darker, something dangerous. The sun had set by the time Jack and Sarah arrived at the rundown motel on the outskirts of town where Richard Hale was holed up. The building was a dilapidated relic, its neon sign flickering weakly in the night. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he and Sarah approached the door of Hale's room, the sound of the footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Jack motioned for Sarah to stay back, his hand hovering over his gun. He didn't want this to turn into a shootout, but he was prepared for anything. He knocked at the door, the sound echoing in the silence. After a tense moment, the door cracked open, revealing Richard Hale, a gaunt man with hollow eyes and a menacing sneer. "Detectives," Hale drawled, his voice laced with mockery. "What brings you here?" "We need to talk, Richard," Jack said, his tone stern. "We know you're behind the murders." Hale's eyes gleamed with something dark and twisted. "Oh, do you now? You think you got it all figured out, don't you?" Jack's grip tightened on his gun, every muscle in his body coiled with tension. "You're coming with us. You're done hurting people." Hale chuckled, a sound that sent chills down Sarah's spine. "You really think you can stop me? I've been doing this for years, right under your nose." "You're too late, detective." Jack's vision tunneled, his focus narrowing on Hale. The memories of the faces of the victims and the years of guilt and pain all came rushing back, overwhelming him. Without thinking, he lunged at Hale, slamming him against the wall, his gun pressed against Hale's chest, his finger hovering over the trigger. Sarah moved quickly, grabbing Jack's arm. "Jack, don't. This isn't the way." But Jack's mind was clouded with rage and sorrow. He wanted to end it, to make Hale pay for everything he had done. He could feel the darkness inside him, the same darkness that had haunted him for years, threatening to consume him. Hale smirked, sensing Jack's hesitation. "Go ahead, detective. Pull the trigger. Just like me." Jack's hand trembled, the weight of the gun heavy in his grip. He could feel Sarah's eyes on him, pleading with him to stop. Slowly, the haze began to lift, and Jack realized what he was about to do. He stepped back, lowering his gun, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You're not worth it," Jack whispered, his anger draining from his voice. Sarah quickly handcuffed Hale, who continued to sneer, but Jack didn't care. He had almost crossed the line, almost let the darkness win. But he hadn't. With Sarah's help, he had pulled back from the brink. The arrest of Richard Hale sent shockwaves through Havenbrook. News of the capture spread quickly, and the townspeople were both relieved and horrified to learn that the killer had been living among them for years. Jack and Sarah worked tirelessly to close the case, gathering evidence and ensuring that Hale would be held accountable for his crimes. But even as the case wrapped up, the events of the night weighed heavily on Jack. The near fatal confrontation had left him shaken, forcing him to confront the darkness that had been lurking within him. He couldn't stop thinking about how close he had come to crossing a line he could have never returned from. One evening, after a long day at the station, Sarah found Jack sitting alone in his office, staring at the case files on his desk. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of his guilt. "You did the right thing, Jack," Sarah said gently, as she sat across from him. Jack looked up at her, his expression troubled. "I almost killed him, Sarah. I wanted to. What does that make me?" Sarah reached out and placed a hand on his. "It makes you human. You've been carrying this burden for years and it nearly broke you. You didn't let it. You chose justice over revenge, and that's what matters." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I could keep doing this. This job, constant darkness, it's too much." Sarah squeezed his hand, offering a small smile. "You're not alone, Jack. We're partners, remember? We'll face it together." Her words brought a measure of comfort to Jack's troubled mind. He knew she was right. He wasn't alone, and as long as he had Sarah by his side, he could keep going. The darkness that had nearly consumed him had been held at bay, and while the scars would remain, he had found the strength to move forward. The day of Richard Hale's trial arrived, and Jack watched as the judge handed down the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Hale's smug demeanor faltered as the reality of his fate set in. Justice had been served, not by vengeance, but by the law. As Jack and Sarah left the courthouse, a sense of closure settled over him. The past had finally been laid to rest, and with it, the ghosts that had haunted him for so long. Jack knew that there would be other cases, other challenges to face, but he also knew that he had the strength to meet them head on. Walking beside Sarah, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had come to the brink and had chosen the path of justice over darkness. The road ahead would not be easy, but with Sarah by his side, Jack was ready to face whatever came next. On that note, that wraps up this story. If you haven't already, I would appreciate if you would like and subscribe. Also, leave a comment on any stories you want me to bring to life. But other than that, while this story may come to an end, the start of another begins.